Catholicism does the same thing. It gives you a framework for thinking about the past and the future and the present. And other religious and philosophical systems do. But this is a method, right?
This is a method. In the dialectic, there's not answers to how you should think. This is a framework to help you to think. So that, for example, Tuli, there's idealists.
Specific?
Okay.
What is this system?
Well,
what is this technique? What is this methodology?
In the universities, knowledge is broken up into disciplines. So we take events which are interconnected in the way that the parts of the body are interconnected and function in, with, and for each other. And in the universities, this is broken up. And some part of what's happening in the world is treated under sociology. Another piece is treated under political science. A third piece under economics. And it's the difference here is the difference between a biologist dealing with the human body and an anatomist dealing with the human body. When a biologist deals with even a relatively unimportant part of the body, like toes or fingers, let alone heart and head, it's not just the piece that they're focusing on which is important, but the way it fits in the whole and how it functions for the whole and how what's going on in the rest of the body is important.
That's a good biologist.
A good biologist. Okay, we take an anatomist dealing with the body, and the body is dead, and the anatomist cuts off a piece and focuses on that single piece. Well, that single piece is no longer what it was when it was connected to the body. The butcher does the same thing to the cow. Think of the different ways that we would talk about a living animal, and the way a butcher who kills the animal and then deals with just one piece of it, the way he thinks about it, the way he talks about it. The whole vocabulary of talking about the pieces of an animal in the butcher shop is very different than our vocabulary in talking about the limbs and other pieces of the animal when it's a part of the living body. So what I'm saying is that undialectical thinking, what this is an attempt to react to and deal with, breaks up knowledge, breaks up the life of our life in society, which is constantly changing and is interconnecting in innumerable ways, breaks this up into bits and pieces and tries to focus on the pieces separately, and in so doing seriously misses some important interconnections and seriously distorts the bits and pieces that they focus on. Dialectics, again, is a set of categories and a framework for thinking which tries to bring into focus and emphasize just those changes, just those interconnections.
All right, so the question immediately occurs to me, since I'm a very politically biased person. Can a conservative, a radical, and a liberal all use this method?
Yes and no. There are idealist versions of dialectics, Hegel, for example, and there have been others. But I do think that insofar as one brings out these interconnections and brings out the possibility, indeed the necessity, that what we see today is going to be different, if not tomorrow, then the day after tomorrow, that this inclines people to begin to ask very fundamental questions and to give the kind of answers which are more attuned to a radical understanding of the world. So let me be concrete. One of the things that you would be able to do with dialectics is to see the way our government is connected to the forces which run our economy. In political science, there's a wall of China which is constructed around politics, and the ruling economic class, the capitalists who own industries, are ever seldom viewed because they're on the other side of the wall. Now, a dialectical approach to politics would make clear that you can't begin to understand what politics is, how it works, for whom it works, and why we find the particular pattern that we do in the outcome of our politics, that is to say, a pattern which over time serves one group's interests far better than the interests of other groups, that group being the capitalist class. A dialectical approach would bring this out, would enable us to focus on it, because the connection between the ruling capitalist class, ruling in the economic sphere, and what the government is, that is the forms it takes, and what it does, would be brought into focus. That connection is never severed. So obviously this leads to radical conclusions.
So the conservative, or the people who are for the status quo, or the establishment, or the government as it exists today in most places, I can't think of any other place it doesn't, would not want to investigate these things. what is the best of all possible worlds, or there's not even any need to delve deeply into politics or the state or government or what is happening in the economy, because Orwell once said that as someone who says they're not political is political, what they mean is that they believe that the politics that exists are okay, they're satisfied.
Yeah. It's very much in the interests of the people who rule our society to have people look at problems one at a time, separate from each other and also statically. So you see a problem with unemployment? I mean, everybody knows there's an unemployment problem, but don't deal with it together with the problems in education, in housing, in poverty. And when you want to deal with some problem in education, okay, treat that separately. And we've all heard the slogan, one thing at a time. Let's deal with this first. Well, that seems to make sense, but it really doesn't, because each of these things is connected in complex ways with the other things, so that to deal with any of these problems, you've got to deal with all of them.
I have a moronic example of this, which is cited over and over again, and particularly, unfortunately, among minority communities or underclass communities in America. If only everyone had a trade, then there would be no unemployment. So if we were to have, for instance, train 50,000 more carpenters, very skilled carpenters, then we could have 50,000 more unemployed carpenters.
Of course.
Because there are already unemployed skilled carpenters.
Sure. We see this whole business about training. You've got to train more people. And the people involved in that don't look enough because their way of thinking, their undialectical way of thinking. Look, undialectical thinking is a little bit like what happens to Humpty Dumpty after he falls off the wall. Remember, Humpty Dumpty falls off the wall, and he's broken into so many pieces that all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put Humpty Dumpty together again. Well, the world that we are encouraged to look at and try to understand is broken up into all these pieces, and therefore it's very hard to make sense of. Okay, the dialectics offers an approach to put these pieces together and make sense of them.
So, later I want you to talk about how this applied in your studies of the U.S. Constitution, but could you define a little more what are some of the techniques and methods of thinking dialectically? Say, all right, can we start? Do you want to talk about the Constitution in these terms? How would you apply what used to seem to me and still seems a little kind of mystical term, dialectics?
Okay, a lot of people
to analyze the establishment of the government, which I think I'll already tell you what my prejudice is. I think a bunch of American colonists, upper-class colonists, were dissatisfied with British mercantilism at the time, which only permitted American businessmen and professionals, mostly lawyers and estate owners, landlords, to rise to a certain level. There were the king's men here. He would appoint his own direct administrators here. This potential ruling class in America felt dissatisfied and created. There were other basic reasons that lower classes had to be opposed to the government too, but they basically captured all the discontent, and probably less than 1% of Americans fought in that war, and they basically captured the system, captured the government throughout the British and the colonial revolt, and established another class system under the guise of bringing us democracy, freedom. Except it was a strange freedom because you had to own property to even vote for it, and they kept pushing the democracy further and further away. They didn't have direct election of the president. They had the state legislatures and then an electoral college, which we still have today. So I consider that a vast deceit. And I think you may have a little.
Well, the first thing I would add, basically I agree with you, but there's an important distinction to make, which you passed over, between the people who made the revolution and were involved in drawing up the Declaration of Independence and who were in the Continental Congress during the War of Independence, and the people who drew up the Constitution. These were not, for the most part, the same people. And some of the leaders in that first period refused to go to the Constitutional Convention. As Patrick Henry, who was always good for a phrase, said, I smell a rat. As Samuel Adams, who was one of the so-called radicals of the time from Massachusetts, said in regard to the people who were gathering in Philadelphia and the founding fathers of the Constitution, he said, it's a gathering of the rich, which it was. This was even in the, if what you say applied in general to all the people, the leaders of that period, those who made the revolution and those who made the Constitution 10 years later, it applied much more to the people who made the Constitution. They were a much narrower bunch in terms of their social class, much more conservative overall in terms of their politics, with certain notable exceptions. Now, what the dialectic approach would help you see right away is that though this is obviously a political act, and it's the basis for the state we live in, you can't begin to make sense of it without looking at the relation to that political act and the social classes of the time. When one major American historian did that, Beard, earlier in the century, and showed the economic interests which motivated most of the founding fathers, he was condemned violently by American media at the time because he was suggesting that something other than the highest altruistic and narrowly political motives, something other than that motivated these people. He was talking about something ugly like dollars and cents and making profit. And yet he showed that, in fact, most of these people were very concerned with those issues. To put it again in the mouth of one of the people of the time, John Jay said, and he's quoted in the book, the people who own the country should rule it. The people who own the country should rule it. Well, they still do, but they don't often put it that crudely. And John Jay did say it just like that. And these were the people who got together. So one of the things that a dialectical approach...
And it was held in secret.
Held, and not only held in secret, because that's generally known. Less known is that they were supposed to hand in the notes they took, and George Washington, our first president, is also our first shredder, because he, as chairman of the convention, shredded, or I don't know, they had a shredding machine at the time, the equivalent of shredding, shredded the notes. And it wasn't until a long time later, when Madison's notes became available, he didn't shred his notes, and this was some 50 years afterwards, that the events of that secret convention and the kind of arguments used, which were largely economic arguments in terms of the self-interests of the people present. It's only when they were known some 50 years later that one can see why we have the kind of constitution we do. And these were mostly for economic reasons.
Who was the deep throat? That was he still alive then? How were they?
His notes were published 3 years after his death. He was very young at the time of the convention, lived for a long time afterwards, and 3 years after his death, his notes were published for the first time, which showed the kind of sentiments suggested in John Jay's comment that those who own the country should rule it. Mind you, this wasn't what everybody said in so many words. Some of them had some less selfish motives for their actions, except this was crucial. And by that time, of course, people started talking about the founding fathers in quasi-religious terms, as if these people were divinely inspired. They were mostly atheists or theists. In any case, very few of them were really religious, and one began to talk about them as divinely inspired, and America and the particular form of government we had and have is something that God wanted for his people in this part of the planet. This is all nonsense.
So let's jump ahead now to America today. I always thought we could use a new constitution, but I guess you need a revolution first.
Yeah, I'm not one of those who think that the problem is in the Constitution as such, because this Constitution, which was as undemocratic as you suggested when you pointed out that only property owners could vote, the way that worked is that it said that the states would determine qualifications for voting, and 12 of the 13 states had serious property qualifications, to say nothing of the fact that women couldn't vote, and of course slaves couldn't vote. So really we're talking about a small number of people who could vote. But there were a number of reforms, a number of amendments to the Constitution, which have made it far more democratic in practice than the Founding Fathers wanted it to be. So one can, the Constitution, like any legal document, can evolve. Are the amendments. And certainly the first 10 amendments. It's interesting to note that these first 10 amendments, the rights that we have as citizens, which I would take to be the most important and best parts of the Constitution, this was put there as a way of winning the support of wavering figures like Jefferson, who was an important political figure at the time, who wasn't present at the convention, but to win his support for the document, this kind of addition had to be made.
When were the first 10 amendments
This
adopted?
was at the very time of the Constitution, because otherwise Jefferson and a number of others wouldn't have supported it. But it's interesting to think that what was best in the Constitution did not come to the minds of those who drew it up. Most of what they were concerned with, as they say again and again, is to keep the people as distant as possible from the levers of power, which brings us back to dialectics. Because one of the major contradictions, which is an important dialectical notion, two things which are connected but yet are pulling in different directions, that one sees in our political system is the contradiction between political democracy, to the extent that it exists in America, and economic servitude of the kind that exists in America. That is to say, one class of people owns the means of production. No one else can get a job, unless, or practically no one else, unless they go into small business by themselves, can get a job unless these owners of the major means of production hire them. And these owners, these capitalists, determine how much we get paid, the conditions of our work. It's a kind of economic servitude. So there is, and this gets reflected in the different amount of money which the different classes make.
Wage slavery has been called.
It's been called wage slavery. Now, this coexists in a system where, at least in theory, the people, and not which means the great majority now, who have the vote, have real political power and can do what they want with anything in the society, including the economic system. So the question is, why don't the people use their political power in order to gain economic power? I mean, if democracy is a good thing, as I think most people believe, then why should we limit it to politics? Why shouldn't it exist throughout our society, and particularly in the economy where people spend most of their lives as workers and consumers? Okay, now, the Founding Fathers were very worried about that, and most of their debates had to do with how do we keep real, meaningful political power out of the hands of the mass of the people, in order so that they won't use it to acquire economic power, which is the power that we, a small minority, now possess. And the real story of the American Republic of the last 200 years is how it's happened that political power has been extended to the mass of the people, and at the same time, this mass of the people seem to have lost their interest, to the extent that it's existed, of acquiring economic power. Why has, in other words, why has this worry on the part of the Founding Fathers proved to be, or so it appears, not too serious a one? How have they gotten away with giving this loaded gun of political democracy, because it is a kind of loaded gun, how have they gotten away to put this loaded gun in the hands of the people and have a people who are not able or willing to use it to promote their own interests? And the answer, very quickly,
It's through the universities.
is through the schools, yes, through the kind of socialization of the people which occurred through the schools, through the way the media have done their job in brainwashing people, through the roles played by the political party. In other words, people have been primed so in such a way so that now that they have potentially political power to change their fate, including their place and the results which come from occupying that place in the economic system, now that they have their power to do something about it, they don't have the vaguest idea of what to do or how to do it. This represents an enormous success on the part of capitalism, and something which we today, who think this is an unjust system which needs to be replaced, have to deal with.
So, how does, this is a self-perpetuating system. For instance, the idiots who who graduate from the Columbia School of Journalism and start working for the Times, think they are doing objective journalism, because they're also products of the system. No one gets into the Times who's an opponent of the the system which the Times supports in its every article, and what it puts in, and especially what it leaves out. For instance, there was once some reporters were accused of working for the CIA. But it's not really that Times works for the CIA. The CIA works for the Times.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like this vicious circle.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we, and we're standing on one foot, tell us how we, how we technically, or what are some of the methods, dialectically speaking, that we can break into this is an amazing thing that we still have this, that we're still allowed to do this. WBAI, I think, is another amazing institution, which I think could not get started in the climate that we have today. The Pacific is like 30 or 40 years old, and it's probably a remnant, I would believe, of the New Deal and that great threat to American capitalism, which existed in the radicalism of the 30s and continued until the new Great War.
Well,
so how do we form our points of contact? By the way, cable is always being challenged. Time Warner used the fact that a few people protested about some shows and they would be subject to being sued. They said their First Amendment rights to pick what they would show have been challenged, and they actually issued a court challenge to all public access, which was turned back by the courts. So how do we penetrate this, and how do we protect ourselves, and how do we advance our penetration of the reproduction of the system through its schools and media?
Well, what you have to see is that though I think those of us who are trying to tell it like it is,
you have 3 minutes.
Those of us like who are trying to tell it what it is, have an essential role to play. But how this gets received depends to a very large extent on what is happening in people's lives. So if they have a job, if it's a secure job, if they're able to buy with that job a car and to buy a house even though it's on mortgage, they're much less likely to hear the kind of criticisms we're making and to feel they're important or to try to do something about them. As they lose their job, as they lose their house, as their car is taken away, they become very sensitive to these questions, and things that you were saying before, all of a sudden, and saying many times before, now you need to say it only once and they understand it and it gets them angry and they want to begin to do something about it.
Right.
So it isn't so much what we can do, because the answer there is simply more of what we're already doing. It has the effect, will come more out of the conditions, and capitalism right now is going like this, and it's going to continue to. It's very funny, the paper talks about coming out of the recession, and in the same page, in the same article, they say, but employment is getting worse and poverty is increasing. What sense does it mean then to say we're getting out of the recession? So they're trying to get people to believe something which obviously isn't true. People are suffering and are going to suffer more, and as they do, the kind of things we're saying are going to become more meaningful, and I think people are going to begin to act upon it very soon, too.
All right, let me add my, is it Jewish pessimism? People have been saying this, opponents of capitalism have been saying this for a long time, and capitalism seems to have, be like a vampire that it's impossible to end. Are we really, is the technology, what's pushing it towards its final, I mean, now we have a supranational, we have a world capitalism.
Right. But
so we have a world crisis then?
We have a world crisis. We can't get out of the crisis as we did in '39 and just after with World War II. We can have lots of small wars, but we can't have big wars because they could destroy the world. Meanwhile, the explosion in not just automation, but computerization and robotization means that we can produce more and more goods with fewer and fewer workers, which means less wages, consumers who can buy less of the junk that's being produced, so that we're going into a pit out of which there is no way to climb out. The situation, and by the way, in the 30
seconds.
In the 30s, there was no way to climb out either, other than World War II, because after things getting slightly better in 37, they got worse after 37. Only World War II got us out of the last depression. No world war is on the agenda, thank goodness. to get us out of this one. It's going to get much worse until the people themselves, those listening and others, get together.